This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.
Hey, this is Erin with Cornell Studio Supply, located in the Gem City of Dayton, Ohio. As a proud sponsor of this episode and the Brickyard Network, we are happy to help you with all your pottery and ceramic sculpture needs by providing the best customer service and world-class workshops. Visit CornellStudioSupply.com for 20% off the largest ceramic book selection of all time. At Cornell Studio Supply, we are owned and operated for potters by potters.
Hi, my name is Kerry Nathanson. I'm a current long-term resident at the Archie Bray Foundation. I just wanted to invite you to come check out our show Push at Modern West Fine Art Gallery in Salt Lake City. It's happening March 25th to the 30th. This show features work from all our current residents at the Bray. We're having a reception Thursday, March 27th from 6 to 9 p.m. For more information, you can visit NCEGA.net or find the exhibition in the NCEGA app.
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 541 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I'm joined by Nathan Murray, who creates multicultural groupings of figure sculptures that explore the intersection of race, class, and culture in America. In our interview, we talk about his recent portrait of Malcolm X, which is now installed at the Nebraska State Capitol, his color theory series, and using non-ceramic materials to create realistic skin tones. We also discuss his connection to Lincoln, Nebraska, where he was raised, and after leaving to go to school at the University of Florida for graduate school, he has now come back to set down roots. You can read more about Nathan in my book, The Complete Guide to Low-Fire Glazes for Potters and Sculptors, or you can visit his website. That's nathanmurraystudios.com. I'm excited to be teaching 2 workshops this summer on ceramic surface design. The first of which will be in Incline Village at UNR Lake Tahoe, June the 16th through the 20th. Also be in Snow Farm, which is in Williamsburg, Massachusetts, August the 14th through the 17th. If you're interested in building layers through mark making and pattern, you can join me on either coast for a week full of experimentation and community. To register, you can visit the link in the show notes. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. What was your introduction to figure sculpture?
My introduction to figure sculpture probably started quite a bit like when I was quite a bit younger. Like I used to like comic books and stuff like that. So, I would see all the different characters and things like that I would want to, just draw. So when I was a kid, I would just copy the images that I was seeing and, try to capture it as best as I could. Once I, actually started going to school for art, it changed a little bit, but the interest in the figure was always there. So it was just a matter of kind of continuing to explore, what I wanted to do with the figure through drawing and painting, and then eventually through ceramics. And I can talk a little bit about kind of my introduction to ceramics too. So I originally, when I went to the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, I had no clue whatsoever that I would like ceramics. I was used to drawing at that point. I like to draw. I hadn't had much experience with paint, but I figured I would at some point, kind of transition over from drawing to painting. One of the semesters, I think 2 or 3 semesters in, I was like, okay, let me get this ceramics class out of the way and move on with my life. But I took Gail Kendall's beginning ceramics class, and one of the interesting things about Gail is she kind of realized pretty quickly that I was interested in figuration, and I didn't really have too much interest in some of the more pottery related aspects. So for one of the assignments, which I believe was a dinner set, I was like, okay, I really want to try making a bust. And, I think I can figure out how to do it. This is my first ceramics class, but I really want to do it. And the way that she teaches, she was very flexible, which completely matches with kind of my personality, like the way I teach as well. So I did that first bust project, self-portrait bust project, and just fell in love with the material. I knew basically nothing about it at the time, so I didn't know anything about how to dry clay or what type of surfaces to use or anything like that. But after that project, I continued doing ceramics classes at UNL, and it was just kind of I got hooked.
Well, for folks that are not in Nebraska, they probably know the school because UNL has such a famous program. It was for years it was Pete Pennell, Gail Kendall, and Eddie Dominguez, who were like three powerhouses of their individual careers. But for you growing up in Nebraska, like did you know that? What was your perception as a Nebraskan of the school itself?
Well, I had no clue about UNL ceramics. UNL was a school that I wanted to go to, and I wanted to go to school for art. When I took that first class, like I said, I knew almost nothing about all the intricacies of the materials and glaze mixing and all of that kind of stuff. But I quickly kind of started to realize the really strong community that UNL had. And one of the other fun things too is there's just so many different undergrads. There were grad students, and everybody was working on projects. I think there was one guy that was working on a life-size figure from Plastergaw casting. And then, of course, as I took more classes, I ended up taking class with Eddie and Pete. So I got to see all of those different perspectives and incredibly different ways of teaching and different ways of exploring clay, but also kind of a synergy that was created with the professors and the grad students and the undergrads.
One of the hallmarks of your work is that it's realistic. Like it looks like an actual person. And I've read during the research I did about you that these are drawn from actual people, but they're not necessarily straight portraits. Like you're combining social commentary, but then referencing specific people. So can you talk about the difference between portraiture of a person and using this medium to talk about ideas and how you think about that?
It's kind of been something that's evolved over the course of my time working in ceramics. So the difference between portraiture, say with like when I'm doing public artwork for the Union for Contemporary Art, or I did the Shirley Tyree bust, or the Malcolm X Hall of Fame bronze. Those are very specific people, but my the way that I can make those is a little more limited because first of all, I'm the most important thing when you're doing portraiture is you have to make it look like the person. You have to capture that likeness, and ideally, you have to capture the spirit of that person with the subtle ways that you handle the facial expressions, their gaze, their gesture, like just all of those little tiny details. So for that, I don't want to say it's like more boring, but there's just a little bit more like I have to work with stakeholders and I can talk about that a little bit more, but the public work, say with Malcolm X, that was an interesting one for me, and I might be kind of jumping all over the place, but uh, for Malcolm X, I had an idea of who Malcolm X was. I had my incredible admiration for his work as a human rights activist and his incredible journey that he went through from going to prison to finding Islam, to getting out of prison and moving up in the Nation of Islam. And then eventually his, trip to Mecca, which really opened his eyes. And, coming back from that, he was ready to work with anyone. He just wanted to push that goal post forward and get the work done that needed to be done. So I had my perceptions of who Malcolm is, his strength, his wisdom, and I wanted to portray that for the piece, which is kind of my original vision. Once I talked with his daughter, Ilyasa Shabazz, I saw Malcolm through a different perspective, because this is the perspective of his daughter, and how she wants to see her father portrayed, which is really important at the end of the day. That feedback from his descendant, his daughter, wanting to see her dad as the peaceful man of God, that was wanted to make our community better, wanted to make our country better, and worked so hard to do that. So with her feedback, she's seen all of the different Malcolm X, the way that people have portrayed him. And one of the biggest things she didn't like was that people would make him look angry, like he'd be shouting, his mouth is open, he's got a big vein popping out of his forehead. So it's really important for her to see the representation of her dad in a way that was respectful and showed him, the way that she saw him. So portraiture, there's stakeholders involved, there's people like Malcolm X's daughter, there's families of these people. So I see it as a responsibility to, first of all, capture the likeness correctly, make it look like these people. And there's so many, sculptures out there where these representations of these people are just completely off. There's memes about it. People send them to me all the time. It's kind of funny. With my own work, the fun thing is that I can get a little bit more creative. So you asked the question about, like, how important is it that I'm using actual people when I'm exploring these ideas? So I think about it like you and I sitting down and having a conversation. So like I've seen your podcasts, I know your work and everything else, but there's a different dynamic when you actually are sitting across the table, or in our case, a computer screen, but kind of the same idea. And you get to know a person, you get to know their quirks, you get to know their body language, you hear their story, and all of these little things can kind of inform like the way that I'm going to create a sculpture. So even when I don't know a person very well, like if I'm seeking somebody out, it's important for me to just sit down with them, have a conversation, and get to know those little things about who they are. So if I'm representing issues that might not necessarily be my issues, or exploring those things, it's important to me to have a certain authenticity to it. So I'm never going to be able to express the experience of this person like they would. But the way I look at the work that I create is it's more of an expression of the time that we had together, the conversations, my understanding of where they're coming from, and then finding out a way to incorporate that in the work, in a way that's authentic, respectful, and interesting. So that's kind of how I look at the difference between portraiture and making my own work.
In one aspect, when you're working with someone who's well known, like with Malcolm X, is that every single part of that sculpture has a specific reference. So it is a bust. It's a bust it's in the Nebraska Capitol, right? That's where
Yeah.
it lives. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So it's a bust that I think is part of a political tradition of showing important people. But there's also some subtle changes that were made in the picture that's in the book. He's in a contemplative stance. Like his hand is up against his face. He's at rest. It's a very different feeling than the one that's actually in the Capitol, which is his arm movement is changed. I believe that his hand is something out like this, as if he's speaking. So in the process of building, it seemed like the content and the mood you were talking about with him changed as you were building that work. Can you talk about how that subtle shift from having his hand against his face to having it out like this, like what the meaning of that is as you as the sculptor have made those changes?
Absolutely. So the original piece that's in your book was actually the my vision for the piece that I brought into the finalist presentations. So for the Hall of Fame bronze, there was a national call for artists. So people submitted, their vision for the work and all their materials from around the country, and they narrowed it down to three people. So at this point in my career, I hadn't really had any experience with working with bronze. So I knew I was going to have some steep competition. So as soon as I knew that I was going to be one of the finalists, what I did is I just started to create the full size piece. Um, so the version that you have in your book is the original piece that I had designed that I actually brought into the finalist presentation. And I was thinking, I wanted to focus on the fact that, Malcolm was an intellectual. He was incredibly intelligent. He was incredibly articulate speaker. He was charming. He was charismatic. So I wanted to just kind of, get him thinking, planning, trying to bring his people forward, trying to do the work that he wanted to do. So that was my original vision. And as I said, when you're working with stakeholders, just to talk a little bit about the people that were involved with the commission. It was the Nebraska Arts Council, History Nebraska, the Malcolm X Foundation in Omaha, Nebraska, and the Ilyasa Shabazz, who is the director of the Shabazz Center in New York City. So, getting feedback from all of these different people. Most important for me, as I said, was Ilyasa's feedback because, direct line there, and all the work that she's doing in New York is, just incredible work. So she wanted to make it a little bit more open and a little bit less closed. So, we kind of came up with the idea to bring the hand out, gesture it out as though he's, kind of engaging with the viewer as they come to see the piece. So that was one of the big changes from that original piece to the final piece that I did after I won the commission. And I really liked the way I liked that change. And once again, like with all of the work I do, if I have that real world connection with this person, and she can tell me how she saw her dad and what was important about that, and I can incorporate that into the work, that's everything for me. That's the important part.
Yeah, and the finished work is amazing. It has I mean, like many bronzes, it has the softness of clay because that's what it's modeled from, but it also has this strength. Like bronze as a material has a strength and an archival nature that clay doesn't necessarily have or doesn't have to have. Can you talk a little bit about commissions being made in bronze versus made in clay or some other type of material that's more fragile?
I love clay, but it was really fun for me, dealing with the bronze work for the first time, just to see this different material. Just to go back a little bit, it was, I believe, 6 months earlier than that Brigitte McQueen at the Union for Contemporary Art was talking to me about their new Shirley Tyree Performing Arts Center. So she was talking about wanting a bust of Shirley Tyree for the new building. She wanted it in bronze, and naturally, I was like, trying to convince her that clay is an incredible material. Clay has a permanence as well. It's going to be here forever. It's never going to be melted down to become something else. Once you create it, it is what it is, and it's not valuable for anything other than the intention of the artist and the viewer. anyways, she was very like she definitely wanted a bronze. So she kind of can, obviously she got the bronze. So for me, I partnered with Les Bruning in at Hot Shops. So he's one of the founders of Hot Shops Art Center in Omaha, Nebraska. So he kind of was available to work with me and um and go through the whole process, the lost wax process, and all the incredible work that's involved in creating bronze work. So I used the water-based clay that I took a cast from with a rubber mold. Um, and I'm actually really glad that I did, because the oil-based clay just has a different feel to it. So I wanted to stick with the water-based clay, and that's what I was comfortable with. Anyways, I went through that process and created the first bronze, and that actually tied in with around the same time that um, I was giving the finalist presentation for the Malcolm X Hall of Fame dedication. So I hadn't had any bronze experience prior to the Shirley Tyree Commission. So I think it was literally the night before the finalist presentations that I was able to go to Omaha, pick up the bronze, take it back to Lincoln, photograph it, do video and all of that stuff. And then the next day was the finalist presentation for the Malcolm X project, and found out shortly after that that I had won that. So it's kind of one of those, serendipitous things where it's like one thing naturally leads into the next thing and everything kind of works out the way it needs to.
And I think going back to the Malcolm X portrait, where the difference of content between the hand motion actually changed the way that the viewer perceives him as a person. And I think your other sculptures have that. I'm thinking about in the Color Theory series, there's a piece that's called Threat, which is a woman that has her head down just slightly and is wearing a hoodie. And the hoodie is an piece of clothing that has come to mean so much since Trayvon Martin was killed. And
Yes.
that was a teenager that was killed. I actually don't know what year that was. Do you know what year he was killed?
I think it was 2014, because that was when I was in grad school at UF, but that actually influenced it a lot.
Well, that's what I was going to say is that this is a teen that was wrongfully murdered. I mean, in this case, it was literally just someone that thought because he was wearing a hoodie that he must be dangerous. But after that, the hoodie took on a different symbol. It was a different symbol. The Miami Heat, LeBron James and Dwayne Wade and all of those people at that time, they come out onto the floor wearing hoodies with their head down in a very specific gesture and tribute to him. And this piece also has that gesture. So it's interesting to me how a gesture culturally can take on a bigger meaning. So can you talk a little bit about Trayvon Martin and just how you came to understand that gesture yourself of wearing a hoodie with your head down?
So when I was in grad school, that's when a lot of those high profile murders of black men happened. So there was Trayvon Martin, there was Mike Brown, there was Eric Garner. There are all these really high profile, cases. And then of course there was the BLM stuff that happened after that. But for me, I think the most interesting thing when all of that was going on was seeing the reactions in the news. So I would see them report this, and then I would see after they talk about what happened, they would subtly or not so subtly justify these murders. Like this person was smoking weed, before this happened, or this person had a criminal record, or this person was selling loose cigarettes, or just anything in order to like take away from the fact of this is a human being that was wrongfully killed. And so I saw that perception, that all playing out in the media, and I knew I wanted to make work that addressed it in some way. Art has a unique way of being able to connect with people, in my opinion. So we see art and we see these things that are these important ideas, these important people. These are things that we should pay attention to. We respect it. So I wanted to address that through the work. And for me, the hoodie for the piece you're talking about, that was a piece that as you walked into the gallery, you just saw the hoodie. So I intentionally placed that piece there so that that's the first thing you see. So whatever it is you believe about the hoodie, whatever its significance means to you, like you're experiencing that as you walk in. As you walk around the piece, you come and you see this beautiful young woman with her head down, serene look on her face. So to a certain extent, I wanted to create a certain amount of cognitive dissonance to the viewer to help them or to allow them to kind of evaluate what their thoughts are on the hoodie and seeing what you assume is a young black person in a hoodie like that. So I wanted to play around with that idea and then also play around with what you discover when you see who this person is, when you look closer. So that was my thought process on that particular piece.
As a part of the show, we should mention there were a bunch of other figures that were in the show, but in one of those, you're depicting a police officer who has their eyes on that figure. So you're showing a social situation, but you're doing it in an art context, which I think can be a place for people to learn. And I also think in a gallery, I think you maybe would let your guard down as opposed to like if you were actually in a crowd and all these figures were together, I think you might have your guard up. Can you talk a little bit about that show, but also what you were hoping people would get out of the combination of all of the figures?
I think all the combination of you made a really good point about people letting their guard down in an art context. So or in an art environment, people are there looking at work, they're open, they're trying to figure out what's going on, they're trying to understand what they're seeing. So I think that's one of the biggest points of why art can contribute to social change is because there is a certain amount of letting your guard down or being more open when you're looking at these figures. So it's not like when you're hearing ideas on the news or in some kind of an echo chamber where basically everybody is just repeating exactly what you believe. It's a space where people can be a little bit more open. And when they see the figures, when they see these representations of people, I think they start to wonder and question about who these people are and they start to unravel the story as they're looking at the work. So color theory was kind of an interesting it was kind of an interesting step for me as an artist because I was using people, specific people, but these people weren't necessarily representing their unique story. They were more playing parts, they were playing ideas. There's the police officer who represents the criminal industrial complex or the prison industrial complex. There was the young black woman in the hoodie. Uh, and there were all of these different things that referenced what was going on in society and the relationship between people of color and, overall just the system, whether it's the, criminal justice system or its representations of what it is to be black or how black people are seen in the country. I was kind of referencing a lot of different things together as a group of figures that kind of told a story. Basically, after that is when I really started to personalize a lot more. I personalized the figure. So it became more about the stories of the individual people rather than, these characters that are playing out these larger things.
I'm interested in how all of these things physically get made. Because one of the things that's interesting to me is how you plan these ideas out over a large amount of time. In my book, there's an image of 7 of those figures. So I can make 7 pots tomorrow. But for you to make 7, full-size busts of people, like there's a long amount of time and planning that needs to go into this. So can you talk about how you conceptualize a show and sort of build this idea in your mind and then how you actually lay out the amount of time it takes to do it?
Yeah, and that's even for me, it's not something that I always nail exactly the way I want to. But starting off, I'll figure out exactly what idea that I want to try to convey as a body of work. Um, So for Color Theory 2, which is my upcoming show, ultimately for me, what I took away from that experience making that work in the past was that I wanted to focus these stories on the individual people that I was talking to and interviewing for this. All of the work touches on larger issues, touches on larger um, ways that their issues intersect together. So for the new body of work, I knew that I wanted to explore, the idea of mixed race people, basically exploring their identity and how that can overlap with other communities. So having this intersectional kind of feeling to the work, where not all of the people have the same experience, but there are these overlapping areas where there are these common areas. As for planning out the time for the work, I've gotten a lot better over the years at figuring out how long these are going to take. So basically, if I think now that it's going to take 2 months to complete a piece, I should basically plan on 3 months, because it's just the way it works. There's always something that comes up. So I try to plan a little more time than I actually need. That way I can really, have what I would consider kind of a relationship or conversation back and forth with the piece that I'm working on. Because I can have my sketches, I can have my ideas, I can think about my metaphors that I'm going to play around with and the imagery. But at the end of the day, when you're actually working with the piece, there's a back and forth that happens with the material, where sometimes the material will tell you what it needs. So I like to try to plan that into it, plan that time for things to happen and for changes to happen, to just go with the flow. But I definitely like to have a combination of perspectives, or combination of points of the larger idea that I'm talking about. So for Color Theory 2, it's all about that connection that individuals have with their background, with their history, with their ethnic identity, how they see themselves, how they interact in the community, their community and other communities. So I'm thinking about those things, and of course, I want a diversity of thought. I want a diversity of ideas, perspectives, ages. I want to touch on a lot of that, but ultimately, the conversations with the people are going to kind of drive the way that I end up making the final work.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of over 4,000 objects made by over 1,000 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfieldcollection.com.
Are you making the journey out to Salt Lake City this year for NCECA? The Archie Bray Clay business is excited to see you all there and can't wait to share some great new tools, glazes, merch, and the always popular Bray Patch and Bray Epoxy. This year, we'll be hosting live book signings with authors Ben Carter and Sunshine Cobb, all at Booth 5 right up front in the expo hall. To stay on top of new product updates, promotions, or to sign up for our newsletter, visit us at archiebrayclay.com.
I wanted to do a deep dive into your process. The shows that we've been talking about are called Color Theory, and it brings up the idea of depicting color, actual color, as in skin tone color, on ceramics, which can be pretty tricky. So I know for you that you do kind of a mix of ceramic surfacing and then non-ceramic surfacing. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you develop that process?
For me, I love clay. I love all of the things clay can do. I love terrasigillata. I love underglazes. I love lusters. I'm not a huge fan of glazes on my actual ceramic work, just because I spend a lot of time really refining details. So a lot of the glazes kind of make you lose that. But first and foremost, I want this to be a ceramic piece, even if after it's done, a lot of it it looks more skin-like, or it looks less ceramic-like. I always leave a little bit of clay, just raw clay that's visible on the piece. But for the surfacing, as I'm building the work, I'm building in texture. So I'm using some of the wonderful qualities of clay, the tactile quality, the fact that it'll pick up any little tiny detail that I put on there, whether it's from a needle tool or if it's a highly rendered, lock of hair that cascades down a face. Um, so when I'm building, I build the texture so that it can absorb it can pick up the whatever pigments I'm putting from an underglaze or a terra sigillata. So the first step that I do is I build the form, I fire it, and then I'll use, black underglaze or mason stains to just kind of create those shadow areas. I'll use that as the base. I'll wipe it away, and then I'll build up uh, layers of color with underglaze usually. So if I have black hair, I'm probably going to have three different colors that I'm going to be using. So I'm going to be using a really dark color. I'm going to be using, a mid-tone, and then I'm going to be using highlights. So from that, after I've built up, the basic color, I fire it again, and then that's when I get in there with the acrylic washes where I, mix the paints, water them down, and then I have an interaction between the underglazes where you can still see them, but they're just slightly changed by the washes that I'm doing over that. Also, skin tones are very tricky, so that often requires a lot of layers. So a lot of that happens, after it's been fired a couple times. And if I do gold luster, that's another firing. So for something like that, gold luster can obviously be really tricky. So if it's something that's I can remove from the piece and fire it separately rather than firing a large bust, multiple times, the less I can fire the work, the better. So I'm just very strategic about those little things.
Do you think working at low fire helps the figure sculpture process?
I have seen wonderful work in high fire. I prefer low fire just because it's very accessible. I also like the idea of using less energy to do this, less fire, like less heat, less electricity. And there's just an accessibility of the earthenware and the feel of it. I love the feel of earthenware clay. If I was doing probably more with ceramic glazes, you know, I might want to do some other types of clay bodies, but for me, earthenware works really well. Feels great in my hands. Plasticity is fantastic, and the amount of detail that you can get from it feels like it's endless. Sit there and work with it.
And the color of terracotta when you're working with it is just, to me, feels amazing. Like it's the color I think clay should be. So whenever I see people using porcelain, I'm like, man, it's so dirty. Like it just looks so white.
Absolutely. And it's a great mid-tone. So it's a great kind of in between, and it's a great place to start off for skin tones too. So it's, a little bit of messing around with it, a little bit of altering it, and you can get it to a good place pretty quickly.
Well, I wanted to wrap up talking about your experience teaching at the Lux Arts Center and also just your experience with Lincoln. You went to school there for your BFA, but then you left, to go to University of Florida, but then you came back. So can you talk about wanting to set roots in Nebraska again, and specifically at the Lux Center in Lincoln?
After grad school, for me, grad school was kind of a deep dive, like we already talked about with Trayvon Martin and a lot of the other issues that happened. I really deep dived into kind of the history, and I think I represented a lot of what I was seeing at the time. So I represented ultimately what I saw as the problems, um, and I really explored and did a deep dive into that. But when I came back to Nebraska, one of the important things for me was working in the community, in my community, the community that I grew up in, and seeing a lot of these things from the inside. So with the Lux Center for the Arts, the Lux Center was great when I came back because they had a ton of outreach programs that I could do. So YSC Youth Service Center was one of them, where the Lux Center partnered with a facility basically where children were incarcerated for various reasons. So we would bring in art projects to these kids, and it really it really personalized a lot of the stuff that I had been exploring in grad school. So I was seeing kids that were influenced. Obviously they had a lot of issues at home, which so much of this stems from. So much of the issues stem from the home, which ultimately I think stems to the mass incarceration. So families are broken up for simple drug crimes and different things like that. And it's just kind of a cascading effect that ultimately destroys communities. So, I mean, that could be an entire other conversation that we would have. But I got a chance to see these kids, and I got a chance to develop relationships with them while we were working on art projects. I would go in there, I'd get patted down, I'd go through a metal detector, go through a bunch of different doors. I was basically going into a prison that held children. So I got a chance to, hear their stories a little bit, and also, break down some of the stuff that they were going through by allowing them to work on these art projects. And I think meaningfully like show these kids that, hey, there's other stuff you can do. There's other ways that you can have these outlets for these emotions that you're feeling and these problems that you're dealing with at home. So that was a really important one for me. Also, speaking of the Lux Center, there was a clay sculpture class that I started. I started teaching there when I was a resident, and I've pretty much taught it ever since. But what clay sculpture class has evolved into is very different than what it started out as, and it really kind of influenced the way that I think about teaching, which is the idea of creating connection, not just with your project that you're working on, but also connection as a community. So when you get 7 to 13 people together in a room, if everybody's working on a different project and they're encouraged to make something that's relevant for them, to explore some aspect of their identity, their racial background, ethnic background, whatever it is, their interests, and you get everyone talking about their ideas and different ways to solve problems. It becomes a really special learning environment slash community. And of course, potluck at the end. Us ceramics people, we love our potlucks. So, you get people sharing food and sharing stories and sharing ideas, and it just becomes a fantastic space. So I've had that class at the Lux Center that's run for quite a few years, and I have regulars that have taken it literally for, a year at a time or whatever. They keep coming back. So that's been a really fun way that I've kind of developed the way that I like to teach, which is to create that connection and investment in the work and the community.
I think art centers are often the places that bigger political ideas come to actually be put into practice. So there's been so much talk about the polarization of America and how we can unify. But I swear, you walk into an art center and especially a class, and you have people from opposite side of the aisle, all different religious preferences, all these different things. And art seems to cut through that. And I just wondered philosophically or like socially why you think that is. Like, why do you think art is able to do what other parts of our society aren't?
That's a really great question, and it's something that I've thought about a lot. Because I am like very interested in a lot of these social ideas. There are people that are way better about talking about them. There are people that are way better at writing about them. But art for me seems like a unique way to contribute to some of that change that I would like to see. And I think when art is done right, it's very inclusive. So it's very open to different people's ideas, different people's perspectives. So like in the clay sculpture class, like I said, I have a variety of people from a variety of backgrounds. There's one person that's working on a Mexican woman that's working on a piece that is basically taking these ancient Mexican deities, Quetzalcoatl, Coatlicue, all of these characters that have based, or all of these deities that have to a certain extent been demonized through colonization, and she's bringing it back into more of a human form, something that's approachable. But with Quatliqué, there's these severed hands and severed hearts that are on the chest area. So it's interesting to me because one of the other students that's in my class, she's very religious, which is great. Um, but she saw the piece and she had kind of a reaction to it where she said, "Well, snakes mean this, and I'm Christian, so that's what snakes mean." And I was just like, "Well, that's great, but one of the important things about art is we have to, take a step back out of who we are, and we have to look at this and understand the context in which the artist is seeing it." And with so many different backgrounds, different religions, different beliefs, um, I think that openness needs to be there. So, like, your opinion is great. That's great to hear your opinion, but also you need to respect this other person because they're coming from a different perspective than you are. So just dealing with that has been great for me as an artist, just to see the different perspectives and try to create an environment where everybody can be heard, everybody's ideas are great as long as you're being respectful to, to your neighbor, to the other classmates, to me. That's I think that is a really special place that can kind of break down that polarization that is so bad today, where people, just want to exist in an echo chamber where they hear their own opinion parroted back at them. So the interaction, seeing somebody, what they're working on, seeing their passion, seeing them struggle with clay, because clay is a tough material to learn for a lot of people. So just that community aspect, I think, helps.
Yeah, and I think there's an inherent struggle to working with clay, which is a good distraction.
Uh-huh.
You know what I mean? Because, like, if you're in this class and you're working through differences between yourself and the other people in the class, or you're working through your perceptions of other ethnicities and what it means to be so-and-so person, no matter what you're thinking, you're still struggling with clay because the reality is it is hard to make work. And
Oh,
it's
yeah.
almost like the great equalizer that allows all that stuff to be going on in your head, but also grounds you in this technically difficult process.
Yeah, and even for me, after working with it for so many years, one of the cool things is when you hit that zone, the zone where your hands are moving and you're creating, but you're not necessarily overanalyzing, you're just doing. So that space, I believe, is kind of the same as like a meditative state. So it's a very like when you actually tap into that, and I think for when students are, learning the materials and they have to focus so hard on what they're doing in order to achieve their goal, uh, it just puts them in a space where they're, I feel like, a little more open to do that.
To wrap up, can you plug your social media and then also when the Color Theory 2 show is happening?
The Color Theory 2 show is going to be in Omaha, Nebraska on May 15th. And my social media is at Nathan Murray Studios on Instagram. I believe it's the same on Facebook, something similar to that. Otherwise, my website is nathanmurraystudios.com.
Well, thanks, man. It was good to see you.
Yeah, great to see you too.
I'd like to thank Nathan for coming on the show and for being in my book. I appreciate his willingness to send in images, and also I really enjoyed seeing how that Malcolm X sculpture took shape from the beginning to the end, which we talked about in this interview. I wanted to thank today's sponsors before we go. That's the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art, Cornell Studio Supply, and Bray Clay. If you or your organization is interested in being a sponsor on the show, you can get in touch at brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back in a few weeks with another episode. We are changing to a bi-weekly schedule for the next couple months. I appreciate your guys' patience as we wait for that next episode, and you can always check out the back catalog. There is the 300 or so episodes that are available on all major podcast apps. And then if you want to become a patron on Patreon, you can make a pledge and have access to the Tales from the Vault. It features about 2 seasons, and I am constantly remastering and adding to that. Again, that's patreon.com/redclayrambler. As always, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in just a bit. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.